that happens all the time in the Druid literature. So these worlds are not impermeable to each other. The three worlds, heaven, earth, and the underworld, are interpermeable. And that's how paradoxical simultaneity works. And if you're a Druid, you could hop between the worlds. It's like the quantum effect. You can make a quantum leap from this normal world, yes, I'll have a cup of tea, please, here's my bus fare, to, like, the divine world and seeing the inner nature of God, or dealing with, the stuff of the underworld, the psychology of the unconscious and all that. So that, I think, is my summing up of this metaphysics. What else do we want from Druid studies? Well, it overlaps with what we can now call goddess studies, because the Celts loved their goddesses. They were not patriarchal when it came to religion. Their goddesses are really important, equally to their male gods. And there's now a thing in religious studies to recognise the divine feminine. There are scholars, Ryan Eisler and many others. Merlin Stone was one of the most important that got me on this path. He wrote a book, Paradise Papers, back in the late 70s, and I realised that the Bible doesn't tell it from the whole perspective. It tells it from the God's perspective and the male priesthoods of the temple in Jerusalem. And the goddess is the enemy for a lot of the text, although she peeks in as wisdom, who actually helps God create the universe. But then she has a sort of bad text, and her priestesses get called all kinds of names, and we know the story. But what Merlin Stone did was she recovered the Bible for goddess studies, and that's important. That work's going on now, and but it's still not really. It is beginning to happen in theology faculties, around, and that's why I set up the Mary Magdalene Studies Association as part of that shift towards looking at the divine feminine within the theological world. So there's goddess studies, and then there's a field of pagan studies, which again is just beginning. It's like tiny little buds coming out. I set up the Pagan Academic Network a while back, and there's an equivalent in America. That's part of Druid studies, because they were pagans, in the original traditional sense of the term. But it's also indigenous studies. So, the people that are studying indigenous religions need to also look at Druidry, that's what I'm saying. And they need to really do it properly with as much care and attention to detail as you would to the more exotic indigeneities. And then there's another way in which Druid studies is relevant, and that's what I call eco-spirituality, or, ecological studies, which, because the Celtic world lived with nature, their gods were often animal-shaped, were plants, their alphabet were trees. They knew the herbs intimately for medicine. This is the indigenous wisdom we've lost of these islands and northern Europe. And so eco-spirituality, again, is a big thing now. People are realising, well, let's learn from the Druids, let's talk to them, those that still remain. Let's look at their manuscripts and learn how to live in harmony with nature before it's too late. Respect the trees, respect the animals, learn their wisdom. And then, so that's why I set up a Global Green University as a vehicle, a service vehicle for that knowledge, to kind of garner it. Most universities are named after a place like Oxford or Cambridge or London. I'm saying we need a global green university, which is about recapturing this ancient ecological wisdom wherever you are. And you can be a student whichever country you're from. Okay, so that's important, I think. That's a little sketch of what Druid studies is. Why does this tradition matter, though? What would it have to say to those in power in today's world? Is there an ethical message from contemporary Druid practitioners in their various orders? We have many different orders, and in fact in different countries. What would its common message be? Well, as I said, the word is the truth seer. I mean, just imagine we had a truth seer in Parliament, and every time somebody lied, they stand up and say, "Oi, you're lying!" Out, and you kick them out of Parliament. I mean, politics would change overnight if you had true truth-seers back on the job. That's what we ought to have. The Dharma-seers, the truth-seers, were the lawyers, the judges and the mediators, the lawgivers, the justice upholders for this whole part of the world, as they are in all indigenous communities. You go to the Council of Elders if you have problems, you know. We need to bring this back, and I've trained as a mediator because of that. I worked with Quakers and others in America to train me in school mediation. Kids need to learn that you can resolve conflicts through mediation, through applied egalitarian intelligence. You can also transform situations through the magical use of music and poetry. Because sometimes people are so full of anger and hatred, they won't mediate, they just insult each other. Well, get the poetry out. That's when the Druid would put the bardic hat on. Because to be a Druid, you had to first be a bard, and you would tell the truth through music or poetry, or through art. So the artists and musicians of our indigenous ancestors were telling truth in complex situations, sometimes obliquely through the arts. And if you think about it, that's what all the great musicians and artists have always done. They are the voice of the bards, if you want. I mean, Shakespeare's not for nothing called the Bard of Britain, you know. And he was telling truth to power in his own way by telling the stupidity of the civil wars and the tragedy of the loss of, you know, people's lives. They were also experts in making potions and psychedelic beers and mead and so on. So these were the chemists of the ancient world and the alchemists. So if you needed a particular kind of potion for a particular kind of a love potion, say, or something to, you know, cheer you up or whatever, they knew which flowers to pick. And that was a specialised thing. I'd love to go back to a place where our medicines are coming from nature, more than from pharmaceutical companies. So the Druids really should be challenging the pharmaceutical giants who extract most of their ingredients from plants anyway, but then they sort of falsify it and put a label on it. I once heard a talk by a Brazilian whose uncle had created what's called a living pharmacy. He'd gone to the jungle in the Amazon region and asked the shamans there. He was a professor of pharmacology at the University of Brazil. He went to the jungle and sought out the great shamans and said, what are the 500 plants you use to treat the kind of problems your people have? And he spent 3 years, and they showed him the 500 plants, different things, roots, bark, flowers, the whole works. And with their permission, he brought cuttings back to his greenhouse at the university, and he grew them all. And being a scientist, he could then study what's in them, and he kind of knew how they worked. But nature packages them with things that minimize the side effects, whereas pharmaceuticals, they don't. So, you know, you heal a headache, but you get the jerks or whatever. These plants, they come packaged by divine intelligence. Anyway, those 500 plants could heal 99% of the illnesses most Brazilians suffer from. And with permission from the government, they created living pharmacies attached to most of the Brazilian cities, which are flourishing to this day. He was given like a knighthood by the Brazilian government. This work is incredible. It should be shared. And I want us to do the same in Europe. I want our Druid shaman and you know, wisdom keepers to tell us what are the 500 plants we need to grow, and then create living pharmacies in France and Ireland and Britain, and they'll be different. Instead of this reliance on pharmaceuticals, which are killing people. They knew that St. John's wort cures, you know, depression, and that magic mushrooms are really good to give you a lift if you're in grief, you know, all kinds of things. And they knew when and how to use psychedelics. Those are sacred plants, which you use very rarely if you want to have a glimpse of the spiritual worlds. And you went to the Druid and said, you know, I really need to do that, please. And you were guided, just as you were in Eleusis in the ancient Greek traditions, because the Greeks were doing the same. And that's why the Greeks and the Druids got on so well. We loved their philosophers and vice versa. We were also creators of the towns, because Europe was an urban, semi-urban culture. These were not just barbarians living in caves, right? They built towns. And I've discovered since moving to Europe that all the great towns of France and northern Italy, and a lot of them were Druid foundations. So geomancers went and laid out Milan and Bologna. These were founded by Celts. Ljubljana in Slovenia, Paris, Salzburg in Austria, and Strasbourg, where the European Parliament is seated, and Londinium, and most of the great towns of Britain and Ireland were founded in the Celtic times. When Caesar brought his armies into Gaul to conquer it, right, he records there were 400 oppida, which is the Roman for towns, and he systematically attacked them all and destroyed them, and usually massacred the inhabitants. Places like Bourges, near me, was an oppida, a town. And these places had temples made of wood. Archaeologists have rediscovered them. And there's about 400 of these oppida being found north of the Alps, which were Celtic foundations. Vienna was one. You know, these are the great cities of Europe. Brussels. And they were all laid out by Druid geomancers. So there's an awful lot to find out here. We're just at the beginning. We also know they were in touch with the Etruscans. The Etruscans were the most magical, mystical people of northern Italy. And they were very religious. They were augurs, seers, just as the Druids were. And you can imagine the Celts of northern Italy and the Etruscans were always having sharings. They were having discussions and sharing, well, that works with us. Have you tried that? Those birds are really good for showing that, you know, whatever. And they love time, the Etruscans. The alphabet I'm using to read to you is an Etruscan alphabet. They loved the Greek alphabet they inherited. And they were writing when the Romans were still like herding sheep. And they taught the Romans all their religion, the Etruscans. And the Romans adopted Etruscan religion. And some of that was Celtic, because the Etruscans and the Celts were very, very close. What about the warriors? People say, yeah, but the Celts were warriors, and they were always fighting. Well, human beings are aggressive, particularly the men, they love to fight. And yes, the Celts were pretty fierce warriors, you know, and they had great swords, and they had the Latin culture made the iron swords for the first time in Europe, which are being found. But for them, warriorship was the last resort. And you only ever went to war if the Druid sanctioned it, who was like above the conflict and would try and resolve it with the Druids of the other tribe. If that totally broke down, you know, some hot bloods went and did something unspeakable like raping their women, then you couldn't stop it. Okay, then only then at the last resort the warriors went in, but they had to respect the rules of warfare. It was you know, there was a certain chivalric thing at play here, and warfare was magical. When the Irish legends about the settling of the Gaels in Ireland, they have to struggle against the magical powers of the land, the Tuatha Dé Danann. It's a series of magical battles. Not many people die. It's more like in the time of Homer, sort of hand-to-hand combat, or like the Mahabharata when Arjuna is fighting and Krishna is helping and advising. Krishna was a druid, effectively, to that warrior caste, but he himself never fought. That's the druid. They stand above the fighting. And so they also knew the stories, they were the storytellers and teachers. And the metallurgists, they brought, as I said, iron to Europe, but they also thought up the idea of putting iron on wheels of wood. So they created the first iron tyres on carts, which opened up long-distance trackways across Europe. And that was a Celtic thing. They were master metallurgists. And I've seen one of the first of those iron rim tyres is in Slovenia, which was a Celtic foundation originally. So we can think of them as, if you want, sacred polymaths. And that to me is what a true academic should be. We should all, the Druids were polymaths. You couldn't be a Druid unless you knew at least 100 subjects really, really well. Well, I don't think you should be an academic unless you knew the same. And that's compacted into the story of Luke, the sun god. Luke is the single most important deity for the Celts all over Europe, in my opinion, and he was seen as the god of the sun. He's honoured in the name of Lyon in France, which was sacred to him. I've been there on pilgrimage. And also Londinium, which was sacred to Luke. And these are cities where everything is possible. You can get everything made, and it's 24/7. So the story of Luke is very important, how he came to Tara. He appeared, knocked on the door as a stranger, nobody knew who he was, and the guard said, well, who are you? We're busy, we've got the gods in there, they're having a party, why should we let you in, stranger? And Lou looked at him, peered at him and said, but I'm a bard, they'll want to hear my songs. But then he went in and said to the group, we've got a bard outside, a wandering bard. And they said, oh no, we've got bards aplenty in here, we don't need more bards. Tell him to get lost. Okay, came out, sorry, we've got enough bards. Well, tell them I'm also a seer. I can see the truth and I can tell your currents of destiny, how they're going to unweave. Went back in. No, we've got enough of those, don't need any more of them. Got loads of them sitting up there. Okay, so this went on and on, right? So tell them I'm a historian. No, got enough of them. Tell them I'm a poet. No, got enough. Tell them I'm a great lover. No, we don't need any more of them. Etc., etc. It went on and on, right? A metallurgist, a warrior, etc. And finally, after about 20, and depending on the version you hear, there are variants, right? After about 20, and each time the guard comes out and says, don't need you, Lou looks at him, and says, okay, now go back again and ask them, is there anyone among them can do all these things? And the guard's on. Penny drops. He goes back in and repeats that, and the other gods say, good point. No, we don't. We all do one or two things max. Better let him in then. And that's how Lu, the sun god, was welcomed to Tara to take his righteous place among the gods. And that story, which is a really important story, is what I call the Lu complex. Sort of like Freud, I've coined this idea of the Lu complex. For people that are frustrated in conventional education because you're forced to do one or two things max, right? You can only do this bit of science or this bit of the arts or whatever. Our instinct as human souls in evolution, in incarnation, is to want to do everything. We are all incarnations of the sun, and we know that. So we want to be an artist, a poet, a dancer, a musician, an engineer, a technician, a lover, etc., etc. But we're not allowed to by the system, because the system is Sophia-phobic. It suppresses people that want wisdom. Now, this is all because of the downfall of the Druid wisdom, which stands for the Lu complex, the right to be admitted to Tara. That's the right of every child in every school in Europe, to know these stories, to know this wisdom. This should be taught. This is good news, right? But of course it's been suppressed because the system, which is a military system, wants to keep us dumbed down into just knowing one or two things max. As Himmler said when he went to Poland after the conquest of Poland and said, these Poles, no, don't teach them anything. Don't let them be clever, just teach them a bit of reading and writing and arithmetic. Don't let them know their history. It was a deliberate dumbing down of the educational offering under Nazi-occupied Poland. And that's kind of what these education systems do. But in the name of Lu, we Druids are fighting back. Okay, what about politics? How can we fight back against power? Because these guys have all the power, right? The UK has suffered years of, an accumulation of a series of catastrophic misgovernments, I would say, at the hands of a corrupt political party that's imposed a fake racist Brexit, a sort of narrative we hate Europe, severing our ties to our neighbours, and where our cultural ties are most interconnected, you know. Well, this is nowhere clearer than in the case of Druidry, because Druidry is a pan-European phenomenon, as I've discovered living in France and researching all this. I lived in Scotland for 7 years, from 2010 to 2017, and realised how important this is in Scotland. 10 years previously, I lived in Wales and researched all the Welsh Druid legends and discovered, you know, the physicians of Myddfai and all the tremendous Taliesin stories and so on. I lived right on the Banwy River where, you know, Taliesin was raised and so on. And then in France, I've realised it's the same. These traditions live on as cultural underknowings. They're not necessarily taught in the schools. Although I have discovered in France they're much more tuned in to these wisdoms. When I moved to my little village in Bétet in the middle of France, I was talking to my French friends who helped me kind of get set up, and they said, "What do you do?" You know, I said, "Well, I'm a bit of a druid, and you know, I'm a philosopher and all that." And the other girl I was talking to, "You're a sorcerer." Yeah, my grandmother was a sorcerer. She lived in that village 100 years ago. You know, like, as if, well, that's just normal. Right? Okay, how do we speak truth to power? Well, in whatever way works for you and whatever your medium is. As a teacher, I tend to teach, but if you're an artist or a poet, do it like that. And there's a legend from the Druid world can help us. A long time ago, the great king of Ireland called Cormac mac Airt was in Tara as the king of Ireland. He was the most just of all the Irish kings. And one evening, a stranger knocked on the door and came in, quite impressive, and gave him hospitality. You know, here, have some mead and whatever. And then he pushed it a bit far because, you know, Cormac really liked this guy and said, "Well, is there anything else I can give you?" "Yeah, I'd like to sleep with your wife. She's very beautiful." And Cormac, like, hang on, you know, knocked the glass over and, like, "No, that's it, mate, no." And started chasing him, but the guy was out the door before he could blink. And he chased him, gathering his little bodyguard, and they chased him down to the beach, where he had a ship moored, and the guy was off before he could blink over the waves. And Cormac got the Navy ship squadron to go after them with him in the prow. And they sailed after this rude stranger for like 2 days. And they came to an island off the west coast, way in the mist, and it had been a strange journey. And they beached, and they saw it was a magical place, this island. There was like a palace and stone carvings of lions and all kinds of things, dolphins, porpoises. Went into the great hall, and there was the stranger on the throne, smiling with sort of beaming eyes. And Cormac said, what on earth were you doing, making me chase after you and insulting my wife? And he said, "Well, I'm Manannan MacLear. I'm the god of the sea. And I knew it was the only way to get you to my magic island. So I came, and sorry about that." Anyway, they got on really well, they had banquets, and then he gave him a cup as a present to take home. A beautiful goblet. And this was a magical cup because when you tell a lie in its presence, it shatters. And then when you tell the truth again, it's restored. And with this magical cup of truth, Cormac mac Airt could tell which of his councillors was lying, which of his political factions were lying. And I say we need to bring back Cormac's cup, you know, and that is the salvation of politics. That's the Druid approach to politics. That's why I've proposed that all politicians in Parliament in every country should have to swear an oath of truth-telling. And if you lie and the cup shatters, then you lose your seat. And it's interesting that Boris Johnson, who I refused to come back to Britain when he was still Prime Minister because he was such a liar, finally is being forced out of Parliament because of lying. I saw this 7 years ago, well, 10 years ago. I mean, I was vaguely in touch with him at a certain point, and then I realised he was a liar. And you cannot work as a Druid with leaders that lie. And it's the same with Putin, with Trump. These are people that use mendacity for power, whereas we use truth for true power, and we share it. Okay, so what do we do concretely? Well, I've set up this Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Britain and Ireland, which was an outreach from my discovery of Ireland's Druid traditions and how ancient and sacred they are. When I realised this, I could see the whole battle of Britain and Ireland in a new light. It's a metaphysical struggle. These Gaels, these Irish, are annoyed that they were conquered by these Anglo-Saxons who don't really know anything about their culture. I think it's shocking that you cannot do an A-level or an O-level in Irish anywhere in England. There's no GCSE in Irish studies. Can't learn the Irish language. And you don't learn about their literature and history and culture and religion. There's nothing about Irish Druidry on the curriculum anywhere in any English school, unless I happen to be head of department or some other Druids. Well, that's wrong. Those are people that we've been fighting, the English have been fighting a battle with for 200 years, and not always playing by very good rules. You know, when the hunger strikers were dying in Ireland because of their perceive of the injustice of the whole situation, the English media didn't care. You know, they sort of, and that kind of racist anti-Irish feeling, I think, is based on ignorance and lack of knowledge of all this. So that's why I set up this Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Britain and Ireland, because until we know these stories, until we respect the ancient ways of the Druids of Ireland and other Celtic cultures, there won't ever really be peace. There might be sort of grudging, you know, rude kind of, well, we're not going to kill you yet kind of stuff. But I think we need something more. And when I was in Ireland, one of our meetings in Belfast, actually, I went afterwards to the pub after we'd had the meeting. I got talking to some locals in Belfast, and I asked a question which I thought was interesting. With all these people being blown up during the time of Troubles, had any like occultists or seers like heard from them? You know, was it rather crowded? And what were they saying? What were they downloading? And we had a very interesting discussion about that. And then the guy told me to read this book by an Irish seer called The Angels in My Hair, about an Irish woman that can see angels. She's very famous now. It's the first time I heard about her. I think that the way to get true peace between cultures is by getting the seers to talk to each other and respect each other's higher visioning. You know. And that's why I went to Tara and did peace ceremonies with the Druids of Ireland. And then some months after that, the Good Friday Agreement was signed. And I was told by one of the Druids present that the IRA had sent someone to check up on the British Druid contingent. And after they discovered we were bona fide, they said, okay, we will make peace with these people. But that's why I was so horrified at Brexit, which was such an insult to the Irish people who'd voted to stay in Europe. They're Europeans. And that's why the people that did Brexit really had no knowledge of what I'm talking about. It's the complete reverse of truth in politics. So that's one thing we can do. And make sure that the time of Troubles doesn't return and that we have a time of truth in Ireland and Britain. And that's an educational job. You know, I want to talk to the Minister of Education in Britain and make sure everything I'm talking about is on the curriculum. And this poetry in Ireland is Bronze Age. It's as old as Homer. You know, so it's really precious. Another thing we can do is set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Stonehenge, which I set up back in the late 90s, and we've had about 35 meetings. And it's still not resolved. We need this pilgrimage centre. And, you know, the pilgrims are still treated with sort of reluctant respect. They're not really given respect. So there's work to be done there. The other place which I've taken this work as a peace druid is to the Middle East, because I think the Middle East is the fulcrum of a lot of the religious turbulence on the planet. And as druids, as religious elders, we should be looking to heal and mediate and and resolve and heal these conflicts. So I went to Israel and Palestine many times, and I set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the Middle East. And I've spoken to Sufis and Kabbalists and Israelis and Palestinians, and they want peace. And they know that we can only get it through this level of knowledge. I've talked to priests in Bethlehem and Sufis in North Israel. And in fact, one of them refused to talk to me for a while, like half a day. He went into a huff and said, I'm not talking to him. He obviously works for MI6. We don't want those bloody types here, And when I said, no, I don't work for MI6, I actually am the Archpeace Druid of Britain, he totally changed. His face broke into smiles, and he wouldn't let go of my hand. And we became, spiritual brothers, because he, as a Sufi, had heard of Druids. I don't know how, from some ancient collective knowledge, And so that was, but that work continues. The people of Egypt, the people of Iran, there has to be healing between Islam, Judaism and Christianity. That's the mission I've taken on as Peace Druid of Europe, right? And I think it's not a problem, because to me, as a Druid, these are all relatively recent religions. Islam is really quite recent, 600 AD. Judaism goes back to alphabetical, like 1700 BC is Abraham. Well, when Avery was already 1,000 years old, Abraham was around, Like, this is older than Abraham, this Druid tradition. And so, of course, we can make peace for these people. They're just our brothers and sisters that have lost their unity, and they call themselves different religions. We don't do that. We see the Dharma within everything. And as for Christianity, well, he was our Druid, as St. Columba said. He was trying to teach, he was trying to heal, he was trying to use prophecy, he was trying to see justice, he was a justice maker. He's a Druid, as far as we're concerned. And he was able to surmount even death in some miraculous way that, the seers of old sometimes were able to do. So, as an interfaith peacemaker, this leads us into the territory of interfaith peacemaking. That's what we Druids should be doing. And finding that common Dharma, that common truth within all the traditions. That's why I'm not a Druid purist. I'm not saying let's all go back and just wear Celtic stuff and just read Celtic languages. No, let's do all that. But then find the Druid within the Christian or the Muslim or the Hindu or the Buddhist, and find that universal Dharma. So I've done a commentary on the whole Quran, like all of it, in detail, line by line, in English, to explain the Quran and I've done it as a Druid. I say, well, look, this is a Druid interpretation here, of what the Arabic actually means from its eternal Dharmic sense. I believe that many other commentators have misjudged what the purpose of the Quran was. They've made it into a weapon of othering, whereas it should be an instrument of divine unity. That was what Muhammad was saying. To me, he was a true seer, he was a Druid, but his work was misunderstood, and it created a religion. Well, no, the point was to get back to the eternal peace truth that is at the core of everything. That's what Islam means, to surrender to that universal truth and to find that unity. And then everyone is your brother and sister. So I've tried to kind of reclaim the Quran for that wisdom path. And I've done the same with Judaism. I've done a commentary, not complete, on the Ketuvim, Psalms, Proverbs, some of the prophets. If I live long enough, I'll do the whole Torah and so on. But to me, that also needs reclaiming. And as a sage of the Kabbalah, that is their ancient Druidry. In